Let's build a town completely out of wood. Why not? We live in a dense forest. We'll fill it with wooden houses, wooden stores, wooden churches, and a large wood furniture factory complete with the byproducts of sawdust and wood chips. We'll clear-cut the forest and burn the unused scraps from the trees. Why worry? We live in a moist climate. The rains will come to put out the fires. What could possibly go wrong? Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast that is devoted to epic failure analysis. Each episode, we will explore moments in history of tremendous cataclysm that caused widespread death and destruction, and investigate what could have been done differently. Our first subject is the Great Peshtigo Fire of 1871, the most fatal fire in North American history. Let's look at the recipe for building a really outstanding raging fire. The combustion triangle is a model used to explain the ingredients needed for fire. In order for fire to occur, the three sides of the triangle must be present, and in order for fire to be extinguished, at least one of the three elements must be removed. The three sides of the combustion triangle are oxygen, heat, and fuel. To produce a fire, one needs flammable material, an availability of oxygen, and a source of sufficient heat. In the Peshtigo fire, all three ingredients would come together in great abundance, but it would be several long, terrifying hours before conditions changed and one of the ingredients was removed. By the middle of the 19th century, Peshtigo was a booming logging town in northern Wisconsin. That part of the country was filled with great forests of pine, spruce, and maple trees, some of the best sources of these woods in America. In 1856, millionaire developer and former Chicago mayor William B. Ogden purchased 2 sawmills and more than 13,000 acres of land. Soon he was operating one of the largest lumber operations in the country, complete with a barge line and several miles of railroad track to carry his product. By 1870, Peshtigo was a town of more than 1,700 residents. Merchants, farmers, blacksmiths, hotel operators, and saloon keepers supporting a growing population of lumberjacks and woodenware factory workers. Many of the people living in the area were recent immigrants from places such as Germany, Sweden, Norway, and Belgium, who arrived to carve out farms on the frontier. Timber and crafted wood products were the main source of revenue for Peshtigo and its surrounding communities. The logging practices of the time would provide an enormous source of fuel for the coming conflagration. Lumberjacks cut down trees by the hundreds of thousands. Concerned about moving maximum product in minimal time, they floated the logs downriver to the sawmills. In the wake the loggers left behind were enormous piles of tree limbs, pine needles, and sawdust, referred to as slag. After the trees were removed from an area, the loggers would set fire to these highly combustible mounds in order to clear debris. They would then move on to the next area, leaving the fire to extinguish on its own. Fires burned constantly. Wisconsinites were accustomed to it. At the same time, farmers were expanding their clearings to create space for more crops by cutting down and burning the trees that stood in their way. Railroad construction workers did the same thing in clearing space for more track. It was also customary for hunters and others who slept outdoors to let their campfires extinguish on their own. Normally, the climate was so wet that Mother Nature would quickly extinguish these small fires. But the fall and winter of 1870 had been particularly dry, and that was followed by an even drier spring and summer. Pine trees snapped in the wind, and the meadows turned brown sooner than any of the indigenous peoples of the area could remember. Marshes and peat bogs were drying out. By the 3rd week of September, the lack of rain allowed many of the man-made fires in the woods to continue burning and spread farther, fed by the abundance of tinder dry material. Small fires grew into larger fires around the periphery of the town, and it wasn't long before the trees started to combust. One day, the residents of Peshtigo looked skyward toward the forests and were shocked to discover thousands of birds covered in white ash flying up out of the woods. Disoriented, the birds crashed into one another before they were pulled downward by the draft of the fire and back into the branches of the burning trees. In the following weeks, bright sparks and cinders blew across the Peshtigo River and set fire to the sawdust and wood slabs piled up next to the woodenware factory. Twice, volunteer crews rushed to form human bucket brigades in order to put out the fires before the flames could reach the factory. When the winds changed direction and cleared out the smoke from the fires, residents thought they were safe. But shortly thereafter, a cyclonic storm moved in from the west, and the wind changed direction again, blowing directly from the burning forest to Peshtigo. The dry front brought with it wind gusts as high as 100 miles per hour. These winds fanned the smaller fires and escalated them to massive proportions. Natural gases, resulting from the burning trees and peat, rose into the air while hot coals fell from the heavens like glowing orange snowflakes. In the day, the skies were an eerie shade of yellow. At night, they were bright red. By October, the air was so thick with smoke that ships on Green Bay and Lake Michigan had to navigate by compass. Harbor masters blew their foghorns to guide them ashore. A dark, murky haze blotted out the sun on the afternoon of October 8th, and Peshtigo's birds and barn cats embarked on a quiet exodus out of town. The Marinette and Peshtigo Eagle reported that evening. The smoke from the fires in the region around was so thick as to be stifling, and hung like a funeral pall over everything, and all was enveloped in Egyptian darkness. A perceptible trembling of the earth was felt, and a distant roar broke the awful silence. The illumination soon became intensified into a lurid glare. The roar deepened into a howl as if all the demons of the infernal pit had been let loose. When the tornado of fire struck, chimneys were blown down, houses were unroofed, and amid the confusion, terror, and terrible apprehensions of the moment, the fiery element in tremendous rolling billows and masses of sheet flame enveloped the devoted village. As the fires appeared on the edge of town, Father Peter Piernan, the pastor of the town's Catholic Church and the most prolific documentarian of the disaster, dug a trench near his house to bury and preserve the holy relics of the church, the Blessed Sacrament, Bibles, vestments, and church ornaments. By the time he returned to his house, he encountered a strange phenomenon. A cloud of sparks that blazed up here and there with a sharp detonating sound like that of a powder exploding flew from room to room. The heat from the approaching fire was so intense that the building and its furnishings were nearing the point of spontaneous combustion that modern firefighters call flashover. While Pernan's dog hid beneath the bed, the temperature near the ceiling of the room must have measured in the hundreds of degrees. Fierce winds ripped away Piernan's fence and gate as he staggered to his buggy. The spinning action from the convection column produced by the rising heat was ferocious. The wildfire was generating its own winds of 60 to 80 miles per hour in the center of town. A fire of Peshtigo's magnitude is said to release the energy of a 20-kiloton atomic bomb every 5 to 15 minutes. Witnesses reported a tornado of fire that reached from the heavens to the ground, appearing like the finger of God. Trees were uprooted and half-ton wagons were flung end over end. One man recalled how great volumes of fire would rise up, 50 feet from the top of the trees, leap over 30 acres of clearing, and in an instant flame up in the forests beyond. Gathering marsh gases hovered over the ground like big black balloons, till they exploded above the ground, throwing fire like shrapnel. Structures and people literally burst into flame. The fire arrived, Piernan said, not as a wave or a surge of flame, but as though it suddenly dropped from the sky. The gust pushed Piernan and his buggy past one of the local taverns, where less than an hour earlier rowdy patrons were drinking and laughing. They had retreated inside to what must have seen the relative safety of the tavern. Within a few minutes, the tavern and a neighboring border house would be swept up by the flames and burned to ash along with everyone inside. One parishioner asked Father Pirnin what to do if the fire got too close. Pirnin replied, "Madam, seek the river at once." It would prove to be the best of many terrible options. The main street out of Peshtigo was packed with frightened people, bumping up against wagons filled with prized possessions and pulled by panicked horses. A family, fleeing from the flames, was suddenly picked up and tossed about by the wind. Others, scampering amid a barrage of falling embers and hot ash, were horrified to discover their hair and clothing catching fire. The heat burned many, causing large blisters on their backs, arms, and faces. Attempting to find refuge, some fled into cellars where they died from asphyxiation. Many, seeking safety, jumped into wells and shallow marshes where they were boiled alive. One group who found sanctuary in a cool stream was stampeded by a herd of terrified cattle. Pirnin, along with most of the other townsfolk, made their way slowly through the terrible confusion to the Peshtigo River. The air was no longer fit to breathe, he wrote, full as it was of sand, dust, ashes, cinders, sparks, smoke, and fire. It was almost impossible to keep one's eyes unclosed to distinguish the road or to recognize people, though the way was crowded with pedestrians as well as vehicles crossing and crashing against each other in the general flight. The neighing of horses, falling chimneys, crashing of uprooted trees, roaring and whistling of the wind, crackling of fire as it ran with lightning-like rapidity from house to house. All sounds were there save that of the human voice. Fleeing residents made their way to the lone bridge leading out of town, only to be met by people from the outlying regions running for their lives, crossing the bridge into town. At the height of the panic, the bridge was clogged with cattle, vehicles, women, children, and men, all pushing and crushing against each other. Conditions in the water were hardly any better. The river was a besieged sea of humanity, filled with flailing limbs of people and animals struggling desperately to stay alive. The waters were full of logs that the lumberjacks had earlier floated downstream toward the sawmills. Set afire by the heat and flames, the logs became scorching missiles, crashing into the terrified hordes. The bridge itself became a weapon of death. As residents with their possessions bumped into farming families with their cattle and livestock, the bridge collapsed under the heavy weight and threw all into the frigid waters of the river. Many drowned. Those who survived the collapse struggled to stay afloat, being blinded by the smoke and ash and fighting to stay above water among the hysterical people and animals. If they were above the water for too long, their clothing or skin would catch fire from the intense heat. Some resorted to using wet blankets, which required constant submersion. Petrified cattle in a death frenzy would often roll over the logs people were clinging to and drown them in the river. One woman gave birth in the cold water, but the baby was never found. Another woman fled into the river, holding one child by the hand and another clinging to her breast rolled up in linen. Once in the river, to her horror, she discovered the wraps of the linen were empty, and her baby was gone. At the banks of the river, as far as the eye could see, there were people standing motionless as statues, some with their eyes staring, upturned towards the heavens, and others with tongues protruded. They were paralyzed with fright. A great many thought this was the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and there was nothing to do but await silent submission to their fate. Father Pirnin pushed people on either side of him into the water. One sprang back with a half-smothered cry, murmuring, "I am wet." Pirnin caught him again and dragged the man out with him into the river as far as possible. At that moment he heard a splash of water along the river's bank. The others had followed Pirnin's example, reassured by the respected clergyman's authority concerning matters of God and fate. The intensity of the heat was increasing, and if they had waited much longer they would have succumbed to asphyxiation or flame. Those who survived the ordeal and endured the hazards of the river spent the next 5.5 hours in the water. At that time it was determined the flames and heat had diminished enough. It was safe to leave. It was the wee hours of the next morning. After a horrendous night of dodging searing flames, the survivors gathered around a heap of burning coals to stay warm. They were joined at the beach by others who survived the ordeal upriver, in the deeper waters beyond the dam clinging to their logs. Those who made it through that wretched night questioned the whereabouts of their loved ones and told gruesome stories of the events just transpired. One was of C.W. Towsley and his family, who found themselves trapped inside their house, encircled by a wall of flame with no means of escape. After watching the fire engulf and kill his wife and one of their children, Towsley grabbed a kitchen knife and slit the throats of his 2 other children and then himself. William Curtis fled his burning house and sought refuge in a well. But because of the prolonged drought leading up to the fire, there was not enough water for full immersion. As flames entered the well, Curtis looped the bucket chain around his neck and hanged himself. Those trapped in the town's boarding house were either roasted alive inside the burning dwelling or consumed by flames in their attempt to escape. The remains of some were so badly charred they were indistinguishable from those of animals. Many corpses were found lying face down in the ground, attempting to extract the last remnants of breathable air. There were accounts of residents far away from the flames spontaneously combusting. So great was the buildup of heat and gases. Karl Lamp and his family, recent German immigrants, fled their burning farm and headed toward the presumed safety of the town. Lamp hitched his team of horses to a wagon and placed his wife and 5 children inside the wagon. During their flight, he heard the screams of his family as their clothing caught fire. Lamp knew he could not stop with the flames so close behind them. When they reached the main road, one of the horses fell. Lamp tried unsuccessfully to get the horse back to its feet. Turning to speak to his wife, he discovered that in the brief time he had gone to the horse's assistance, his wife and 5 children were consumed and burnt alive by the flames. The prevailing winds were from the south at the beginning of the fires, driving them south to north throughout Wisconsin and parts of Michigan. Such vaporizing heat in a large area, at up to 2,000+ degrees Fahrenheit, created its own environment of tornadoes and superheated hurricane winds, drawing heat upward. This is thought by meteorologists studying present-day forest fires to have created a massive sucking of cooler air from Canada and the western U.S. That condition created counterwinds, first to feed more oxygen to the fire, then strong enough to cause a major change in wind direction and blow the fire back onto itself. Having no more fresh fuel, it died out. In terms of lives lost, the fire at Peshtigo was the most destructive natural disaster of its kind in North America. More than 1,500 people lost their lives, and more than 2,400 square miles, an area twice as large as the state of Rhode Island, were ravaged and destroyed. However, the incident was largely forgotten, as it happened on the same night as the Great Chicago Fire, which grabbed all of the headlines and attention. In fact, the governor of Wisconsin, Lucius Fairchild, was on his way to aid the city of Chicago when the first telegram from Peshtigo seeking assistance arrived at his office. Fortunately, the telegram was handed to the quick-thinking governor's wife, Frances Fairchild, who ordered a train loaded with relief supplies for Chicago to be rerouted to Peshtigo. She also organized the delivery of much-needed blankets and food to the devastated area. That wasn't the end of the monstrous fires. As the lumber camps, railroads, and settlers moved west, the fires moved with them. In Minnesota, there were several major fires. In 1894, a fire in Hinckley killed 400 people. And in 1918, the Cloquet Fire killed more than 500 people. The fires continued as long as there were trees to turn into lumber. They weren't going to stop the practices that were making them rich, simple as that, says author and fire expert Peter Leshik. It wasn't worth it to them to treat the slash, to log in a way that would not create such fuel. And essentially that era ended when all the big timber was gone. The Peshtigo fire was horrific, but many years later scientists tried to recreate it. During World War II, the U.S. and British military studied the Peshtigo fire to learn how to make firestorms. With dramatic consequences, the Allies reproduced the firestorm by dropping thousands of tons of bombs and incendiaries on Dresden and Tokyo. More people died in those cities than died in Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the atomic bombs were dropped. They actually made a demo first, author Denise Guest says, a little-scale model of wooden buildings, and studied how you would drop bombs until it created a firestorm, something that devastating and that hot. The timber and railroad practices that were a major contributing cause to the fire continued for many decades until most of the valuable timber from those areas were cleared. It was only later that fire prevention practices grew more common. What are some of the mistakes we can learn from the Peshtigo fire? First, there was the disregard for safe practices prior to the fire, inattention to smoldering fires, the predominance of wooden structures and furniture, and the movement of livestock and goods during the crisis. In general, there was no evacuation plan in place prior to the disaster, or any form of organized leadership during the conflagration. The absence of proper firefighting equipment made any kind of adequate defensive measures nearly impossible. The people of Peshtigo and the surrounding areas were completely unprepared. There was a widespread belief that the area's climate was too wet to allow for such a destructive fire. If you would like to learn more about this podcast, please visit my website at www.thepodcastofdoom. On the website, you may comment regarding your thoughts, or by emailing me at podcastofdoom, pod@gmail.com. Until our next episode, keep your ears pinned and your tails taut.